Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, welcome to our meeting here tonight, and it's good to see such a good roll-up considering the activity in Adelaide tonight and probably difficulty with parking to some extent. But I hope that you enjoy our presentation tonight and we'll see what transpires. So this is another Hermannsburg type presentation. So how many people here have had past contact with the Hermannsburg Mission? Well, welcome. So before we have our presentation, there's a few announcements and a few speakers, and I'll call on Lois first. So maybe if you stay there.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So just to announce what's coming up at our next meeting. Our next meeting is, of course, in the busiest month of the year for all who are interested in history, the South Australia's History Festival, a month-long festival from the 1st to the last day of May, and hundreds of events presented by hundreds of different historical associations around the state with all sorts of delights for you. And FoLA has a particular delight, of course. We have Dr. Philip Jones, a senior curator from the South Australian Museum, who has written many very interesting books about all sorts of very interesting topics. Camellias and the Uendamil doors and I've forgotten the title, Rust and... Thank you. Here we are. Which, of course, won a grand literary prize. So he's a very well published and very well appreciated, much appreciated historian in various aspects of this field, of the various aspects that the museum, in fact, concerns itself with. And he will be speaking about one particular one which has special reference for us Lutherans, and that is on the work of George French Angus. Now, of course, you've all heard of George Fife Angus, who was so important for the migration of the early Old Lutherans to South Australia, which not only started the migration of Lutherans and other Germans to South Australia, but to the whole of Australia virtually. And so George Fife Angus was very important. His son, who came here, an artist at a very young age, and spent time here in South Australia sketching what he had seen here, including, of course, our German villages, which were the villages that his father had promoted. And so he also explored South Australia. He was very interested in the Aboriginal people of South Australia and their artefacts. And Philip Jones has been exploring George French Angus's work for decades, and we now have a very beautifully illustrated, richly illustrated book that condenses Philip's great knowledge in this field of George French Angus as an illustrator, not only in South Australia, but also in New Zealand and South Africa. So that is a very special treat that FoLA is presenting for you in our History Festival presentation on Thursday the 27th? 5th. Yes, I knew I was going to get those wrong. On Thursday the 25th of May, here in this venue. That is only one of the events that you will be interested in during that month. And I would ask, I have two speakers lined up to tell you about two other events. We have, first of all, Pauline Berger will speak to you about the exhibition that the Bethlehem congregation in Flinders Street is presenting on the Martin Luther School, the school at the Bethlehem congregation. And after that, Dr. Peter Micken will be informing you about the German Heritage Research Group seminar for this year. So I'd ask Pauline to come and tell us about the Martin Luther School exhibition, followed by Peter Micken. Thanks, Pauline.
Thank you, Lois. How many of you are aware of the Martin Luther School? Oh, a few, that's excellent. Just to briefly, and do most of you know the Bethlehem Church in Flinders Street? Right. When it was first built, at the rear in the vestry, they used to have school. After a number, and that was 1873. About 10 years later, they decided to build a proper school. So they actually, at the rear of the church, there's another old building which has got arches because it was actually stables where the pastors and the teachers could drive their horse and cart or whatever in for the day. And above that they had two classrooms, and that was named the Martin Luther School, obviously because of Luther's keen support for education. And as most of you know, in the early years of German settlers, they tended to build a church and a school. There's not a huge amount of information, but what we've got is just fascinating. And some of you may know June Jenke, who did a lot of research in 1983. They produced this history of Martin Luther School, which has got some fascinating stuff in it. I've got a couple of copies to show. If you come along to the exhibition, you'll be given a free copy, if you're very good, of this book, because we've got some left. Now, it's being launched on the first Sunday of May, 7th of May, Sunday the 7th of May, and it continues then Monday, Tuesday and Thursday of the following week, so the 8th, the 9th and the 12th, 10th, 11th. So it's all in my spiel here. From 11 in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There's no access for wheelchairs. It's upstairs. The exhibition will be upstairs. We will have some information in the ground floor, what was the old stables. The upstairs was then converted into what is now called Excelsior Hall. Be delighted to see you there. I've got some flyers if you want the details, and you can see me after this meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. Dr. Micken.
Herr Sergenschnitte. So, schönen guten Abend, herzlich willkommen alle Leute. Hoffentlich könnt ihr gut Deutsch verstehen. Ich habe hier Informationen über ein Seminar, das am 27. Mai in Tanunda stattfindet. Now, I hope most of you understood that. Otherwise, you are victims of linguicide, as my colleague says. The death of the German language, at least in the Barossa. On the 27th of May, all day, as part of History Month, there is a seminar which is entitled South Australian German Connections, Networks, Travel, Business and Communications. The program is a full-day program with about 12 speakers speaking for about 10 minutes each on particular topics. And to give you some idea of the topics, we've got talks about clan migration, where somebody comes, for example, Julie Wickett is talking about Gottlieb comes and the Schulz clan migration. So very often, to maintain connections, people wrote letters home to their local village, local newspaper was reported, and people were encouraged to come. And so there's talks about clan migration. There's discussion about the exchange of letters and how families maintained contact. So the migration of migrants in the mid-19th century did not just finish when they came here, but business, imports, exports, study, etc. continued. Now, this is the most valuable event you can attend because you get a full lunch prepared by an excellent chef, professional chef, and you get a full day's information. Now, this is what's called in education knowledge building, that real knowledge building. So there's an opportunity to find out a lot about different family business connections. I'm supposed to be talking to this thing. So Saturday, May the 27th, I've handed out some registration forms. You can start registering as soon as you leave this hall, or you can while David's talking. You can just, Google it straight away. If you have not yet received a copy, there's some copies out on the desk, and I've got a couple here. I want to also, so are there any questions, first of all, about that seminar? Herzlich willkommen, muss ich sagen. Das ist im Barossa Tal, und da spricht man nur Deutsch, und alle Leute sind da herzlich willkommen. They only speak German in the Barossa, don't they? Herr Sergenschnitter? As somebody just said to me, Frau Grosser, a moment ago, she said, Deutsch ist verboten. She said German was forbidden when she was a child. So, and that's what many people tell us. Here is a bilingual newspaper. So since the closing of Irish printing press, about 1917, this is the first bilingual press newspaper that's been produced, almost. It's called Das Blatt. If somebody would like Das Blatt, it's about the work of the Barossa German Language Association, which is helping with the organization of the seminar. And it's got events, Kaffee und Kuchen, recipes, and information about many different events that we've got going. We've got a very big push to reintroduce the kind of program that Pauline just spoke to us about, bilingual German programs in the Barossa. So we had meetings yesterday with MPs. We got meetings on Monday with Education Department people, trying to get resources to restore bilingual
Okay, we'll get there yet. Now, I should also mention that our meeting tonight is being live streamed again, and so we welcome all those people who are watching the program on live stream as well. It's amazing technology, really, and after the end of this program, we can tell approximately how many people watched it, and so it's amazing technology. Now, another thing, we like to keep a record of people who attended the meeting, and there could have been a few people who came into the church here before the attendance book was available. So if you haven't signed in yet, please do so before you leave tonight. So now we come to the most important part of the night, to hear the presentation from David, and I'll call on Tony Collins to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Jeff. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's presentation to Friends of the Lutheran Archives by Dr. David Moore. My name is Tony Collins. When Ivan Christian asked me to introduce David this evening, I was very pleased to do so due to my connections not only with David but also some of the family relatives of the person about tonight's presentation. Tonight's presentation is about. Plus my ongoing work with the Alice Springs Old Lutheran Church History Team. That's a small group of people in Alice Springs led by Olga Radke, whom I'm sure many of you know. David is a long-term resident of Central Australia, a highly skilled linguist, interpreter and translator of numerous Aboriginal languages of the Central Desert region. In 2019, David completed his PhD on the topic of German Lutheran missionaries and the description of Central Australian languages 1890 to 1910. Since 2020, he's been working on a database of the Western Aranda to English dictionary in conjunction with his work teaching Aboriginal languages in Alice Springs schools, which he does along with his wife Susan over here. Tonight's presentation is titled Ein Bushman, kann less. I'm not sure whether I got the pronunciation fully correct with the German speaker prior, but that in English is a bushman can do anything. These are some of the words from the focus of tonight's presentation, a very significant person in the life of and God's work at Hermannsburg Mission in the early 20th century. That person is Hermann Adolph Heinrich, also known as H.A. Heinrich. Called Adolf or Dolph by family, known as Teacher Heinrich by the Hermannsburg community, tonight's presentation is focused on the time from late 1922, following the death of Pastor Carl Strehlow at Horseshoe Bend, to the arrival of Pastor F.W. Albrecht to Hermannsburg in April 1926. During these 3 or so years, H.A. Heinrich, supported by his wife Hilda, stepped in to run and lead the Hermannsburg Mission Station in both a human and spiritual sense. In this most interesting period of the Hermannsburg Mission, which David calls the Heinrich era, H.A. Heinrich led the growth of the mission in new directions. Tonight's presentation is an opportunity for all of us to be informed more of and to celebrate and thank God for the outstanding work and lives of Adolf and Hilda Heinrich at Hermannsburg Mission, particularly during the Heinrich era. As the first part of his presentation tonight, David will introduce a couple of our special guests this evening, and then the first part of his presentation will be a video which is being produced in Alice Springs about H.A. Heinrich and family. David, thank you.
FoLA for the chance to speak here tonight and talk about somebody who's probably unsung, undersung in Hermannsburg's history. And tonight we have two, H.A. Heinrich's daughter here, Elena, who's helped me a lot with finding information about her father and about that time in Hermannsburg. And her friend Dennis is here as well. So welcome, willkommen. Ein Buschmann, yeah. Ein Buschmann kann alles is a title which comes from a book which I'll talk about later. It's a bilingual title because Heinrich himself was bilingual. It's hard to know how bilingual or how much he spoke of one language or the other, but those are his words, those are his reported words. Ein Buschmann kann alles. And it appears in a book which we'll discuss a bit later. First, I'd like to have a look at the video that was made by Anne Shearer, which is an overview of Heinrich's life. And we'll just watch this to... Yeah, something like that. So, Heinrich's journey to Central Australia. Journey by camel train back in the day. This is before the train was established and was set up in Alice Springs. Hermannsburg Mission and Heinrich's parents. Got this sound? Yeah. Yeah, the sound that goes with this, we might just see if we can get that. So, this is Nain, the school that Heinrich first taught at, and previously saw Point Pass. This is all about the we look like we don't have sound at the moment. So this is the family of Carl Strehlow. There was a missionary at that time when Heinrich arrived to take up teaching in the school there. So you can see this is the Hermannsburg school. This is Heinrich and Luricher men. So much work at this time was done on horseback. The congregation and Luricher people have come in from the bush. Another aspect of his life is that he took hundreds of photographs, and this is his camera. Some of the school with Heinrich there. Yep. Chasm. Sound chasm. Okay, these are housing at the time. Yeah, so we haven't got sound, I think, at the moment, but you can view this at another time. And it's right. So our story will start from Horseshoe Bend with Carl Strehlow's death on October 20, 1922, when the key missionary at Hermannsburg dies after a 10-day journey, and Hermannsburg's really at a loss. So last year we went to Horseshoe Bend and Carl Strehlow's life, and we thought about what would have happened with Hermannsburg after Strehlow passed away, after he died. Who would lead the mission? There had been a number of calls that were sent out for a missionary to replace Carl Strehlow, as he realised that he wasn't going to be able to continue, and the family planned to return to Germany at some point. But there was no one who came up to take his place. So Hermannsburg was in a really crisis situation, and Heinrich was probably the most experienced staff member at that time. He had arrived in Hermannsburg to be the teacher at the school, 17, at the end of 1917, and born in 1895, he went through school and did some teacher training at Point Pass Academy, and from there he became a teacher at Nain School in 1912. There about 5 years, and I think he had about 43 students at Nain. Around the middle of 1917, German schools were closed in South Australia, and Heinrich left. So around July, I think it was, 1917, Heinrich then starts looking at making a trip up to Hermannsburg. Around this point, there hadn't been teachers, there hadn't been consistent teaching at Hermannsburg School. So Heinrich arrives late 1917, and he's there for 15 years. And he becomes, as we heard earlier, teacher Heinrich, Lehrer Heinrich, and after Carl Strehlow dies, Heinrich's workload just increases enormously. He has all of these different functions he has to fulfill because there's no missionary. And far from being a catastrophe, and far from being a sort of an incompetent young 27-year-old man, he actually turns out to be a highly capable leader of the Hermannsburg Mission. What I'm talking about tonight is about someone who had multiple skills and talents, but is not often regarded as being a leader at Hermannsburg. So that's the title. As Heinrich said about himself, ein Buschmann kann alles. We might go to this presentation now. Let's see if so this interest, I guess, we've looked at last year being the centenary of Strehlow's death, and that was commemorated in 2022. His death at Horseshoe Bend. This team that was mentioned earlier, that Tony mentioned earlier, with Olga Radke very much at the centre, and Anne Shearer on the left of the photo, and David Hewitt, have been working on history in Central Australia, and have got a whole array of projects that they're working on going back and looking at particular commemorative events. And so we've turned our attention to looking at someone who hasn't had a lot of attention, that's Adolph Heinrich. Next slide. So the Strehlows, you probably know some of the history of the Carl and Frida Strehlow. Carl Strehlow went to Hermannsburg to be the mission in 1894, following the departure of the Hermannsburger missionaries in 1891. Married Frida Kaiser in 1895, and Carl Strehlow stayed there as the pastor and missionary of the Hermannsburg congregation and community for nearly 30 years, about 28 when you include times that they were away. They went to Europe in 1910 to 1912, but then remained at Hermannsburg. And around 1920 they were looking at leaving and going back to Europe, and Carl would take on a position over there in Europe. He became critically ill around the middle of 19 and found that there was just no replacement. A number of calls were issued, and the committee chairman, Johannes Stolz, looked at coming up and taking over, but that seemed to be not a possibility. He had a heavy workload back in his congregation in the south. This is the Hermannsburg Church building. So, one of Carl Strehlow's main achievements was to document and work on the language of Aranda, which he's well known for, and his predecessors had worked on Aranda, Western Aranda language. So this is Kemper, Schulze and Schwartz, the Hermannsburger missionaries. Carl Strehlow actually extended into working with literature. So if you have a look on this map of Aboriginal languages in Australia, does anyone know where Aranda would be on the map there? So in terms of shading and colour, right in the centre, the blue is Aranda, extending from around about north or around about Udinadatta right up to towards Tea Tree and far to the west. So the blue right in the centre of the continent is Aranda. To the west of that, or to the left on the picture, is an orange patch you can see there. That's where the Luritja language is spoken. And the Luritja language relates to languages to the south particularly and west of the Western Desert group. So Luritja is a Western Desert language. It wasn't well known to the wider world until around about 1907. So in 1906, Carl Strehlow met Jalpo, who is a Luritja man who'd been spearing cattle, and Carl Strehlow healed him or helped him with wounds that he had, and so I was able to work with Jalpo on learning more about the Luritja language. When Carl Strehlow started publishing his book, Die Aranda und Luritja Stämme, in 1907, that was published in 5 volumes between 1907 and 1920, that was the first time that Luritja was really written down, or any Western desert language was written down and became known to science and became known to the wider world. And Luritja is important for this story too, because Luritja becomes very focal in the 1920s. Just go to our next slide. So, what was the actual leadership or structure of Hermannsburg back in the 1920s, late 1922, when Mission Committee Chair Stolz went to Hermannsburg to look after the place after the loss of the missionary? It seems that Stolz was there until about late 1922 and then returned to Adelaide. And the Mission Committee wondering what to do. There'd be occasional visits from pastors from the south, like Stolz and the Mission Committee, but they decided really that Heinrich was the one who was going to run and do much of the work, even thought of ordaining him as a missionary. So this is from the Mission Committee's minutes. If they can't find somebody else, then Lehrer Heinrich will become ordained. So there was nobody on the horizon, even as late as, was it 4th of December 1924. Just go, yeah, that's right. So I'm going to now talk about three areas Heinrich made a really distinctive contribution. So far from being a kind of a holding pattern or a kind of interim fill-in type of person who went from late 1922 to the arrival of F.W. Albrecht in April 1926, there's actually distinctive contributions from Heinrich. In der Schule, the first school there, anyone from Nain might recognise people here in this photo of Adolf Heinrich's class. Talk to us later, because wondering who these children are. Yeah. So this is early research. We've been doing this for a few months now, and we've got a lot to learn. So if anyone can tell us more about Nain, he comes from Nain, then we'd love to know. So he moved to Central Australia because of the closing of the bilingual schools. So Heinrich's a practiced bilingual teacher. He's been in a German-English school for 5 years. And according to the standards of the time, he's a trained teacher. There were no teachers' colleges at this time. People were trained when the classroom monitor or the oldest pupil or the most capable pupil taught others. And Point Pass was the place where that was the centre of that kind of training and ongoing higher education, such as it was in that time. He then goes to Hermannsburg, where he has 52 children, 52 pupils, students in his class, and this is a lot of students to manage. No one would put up with it these days. It's an enormous task if that's all he did. Of course, after Strellow's death, and Heinrich is taking over more responsibilities, the school and the work going. And so he's working with people like Moses Jalkaputter and other Aranda men, teaching with them. He's also developed a kind of peer teaching system where he gets some students to teach others. And he's drawing on as much help as what he can get. There's an account of Heinrich's classroom in this book, Walter Geisler's Durch Australiens Wildnis. In der Schule is the section. This book is not widely known, but a lot of it's about Central in Halle. And he met Heinrich, and they go on a pack horse journey through the Macdonnell Ranges. And there's all kinds of interesting descriptions in this book about riding through the ranges, meeting up with literature people, and the kinds of learning and discoveries he makes there. He's on a kind of a mission to find out more geographically about the region, but he's actually very interested in the human element as well. And he talks to Heinrich about, how do you run this? How does the school work? How many students have you got? I've got 52 students, and I have 8 levels. I have them for 8 years, I think it is, and there are 5 levels. And he gets some students trained up to teach others. This is peer teaching. He teaches multiplication and division by... Geisler says to him, but the students don't like sitting still. How do you keep them here in class? And Heinrich's, I think, answer is that he goes on excursions a lot, which is exactly what we do these days when we're teaching Aranda classes in Central Australia. We use bush trips, excursions, and we can talk a bit more with Susan Moore, who's the principal of the Alice Springs Language Centre, which teaches Aranda in the year 2023 in a program that's a kind of a descendant, in many ways, of the Heinrich School. Geisler's quite fascinated by this. He sees that Heinrich has done all kinds of adaptations and interesting ways of making learning relevant and adapting teaching to the local school where these students speak Aranda as a first language and Little English is really an achievement. He's a pioneer of education, actually. Oops, I was just going to talk about, if we can go back a couple of slides. Hermannsburg School, and you can see this is Heinrich's class. No one would put up with it these days. They'd be going to the union. Hard to make out here, but I think it looks like Moses. So there's a whole lot of people who stepped in. So not only Heinrich, but a whole lot of Aboriginal people stepped in to teach in the school, to run church services, and supported Heinrich in all of this additional workload that he had. So he was a successful teacher, and a number of his pupils included T.G.H. Strehlow, who became Professor of Anthropology and Linguistics at Adelaide Uni, Obed Raggett, who was one of those students who was one of the more advanced students who Heinrich got to teach the others, and Obed Raggett went on to become a church leader and also become involved in bilingual education with a number of literature books that have been translated by Raggett. And so he worked in the bilingual literature program. And another one is Pastor J.E. Materney, who is clearly inspired by his teacher, Adolph Heinrich. As he says in the introduction to the Heinrich family book, Heinrich brothers from Hawker. And that inspired J. Matterney to become a pastor in the church, and Matterney wrote the introduction to the Heinrich family book. Next slide, if we can. Just going to mention, the ride through the Macdonnell Ranges. What does it mean, German? Right, so lots of interesting uses of new words like kette to mean range. Was heißt Kette in English? Range or chain, yes. So one of his innovations is the popular song, I think in Germany around the time, is Die Lorelei. And Geisler's there talking to Heinrich in the school and says, "You've translated Die Lorelei into Aranda." And this is sort of adaptability. So Lorelei, I don't know if anyone knows this story. The song. You know the story of the siren who sings, and the sailors are wrecked on the rocks. And it probably doesn't really translate that well in Hermannsburg. In 1926, it's about sailing in ships and being sort of entranced by sirens and things like that. This is the rock, I think. The Lorelei, the place where the alluring sounds come from. So I saw this at the age of 7. That was the beginning of my journey. But it's nothing like the original because, as he tells Geisler in here, I had to change it because my Aboriginal students were not interested in the original story. They were much more interested in kangaroos. And so it's become changed, maybe with the same tune, become changed into a song about how the kangaroos, which used to be common on the hills around Hermannsburg, are now disappearing. And so this song is sung whenever some distinguished visitor like Geisler turns up, and there are many, many distinguished visitors who turn up. And Heinrich has translated all of these songs for the occasion. So I think that Geisler gives the children lollies, candy canes, and they start it with a round of "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow," sung in Aranda. And then there's another one, there's a whole lot of others. I just mentioned that amongst their other achievements that Dolph and Hilda Heinrich produced was a visitor's book, which Alona has very kindly made available. This isn't the original, but if you want to have a look at this, this shows the visitors who were there in the 1920s and 30s, I think it was, who passed through Hermannsburg and who wrote comments in the book. They maintain this visitors book so you can see who was passing through Hermannsburg, because during that time all kinds of people turned up. Often they were doing research. This is a frontier place. This was where you went if you wanted to go to the very end of the civilised or known world. That was the attitude. Probably more people went through when the railway was put in 1929, but there are actually a lot of people who went through. So we're really fortunate to have that record, because I think it's a really unique record. We're finding out who was passing through Hermannsburg and what did they think of the place, and what did they think of the mission.
Excuse me, David, you might just mention those posters that are connected with the books.
We might pass these around if. Yeah, we can have a look at the end, but there's posters there that have come from this research, and the person who's put together the little videos, Anne Shearer, who's been working on this. So Anne Shearer, Olga Radke and and David Hewitt. Next slide, please. Yes, the ride through the Macdonnell Range. A whole chapter in durch Australiens Wildnis. It goes right through these canyons and kind of impassable, seemingly impassable areas where Heinrich obviously was a bushman. He'd been for 9 years learning the language, learning Aranda, and going on these excursions. A combination of people. He obviously has academic ability, and he also has a lot of practical ability. So they're going on pack horses and riding horses, and then taking them through the range with an Aranda man by the name of Terence, and they also meet Luritja people on their journeys as well. Next slide, please. So Geisler signs his name, July 24, 1926. And next slide. Can anyone read that? Unsere schönen Aufschläge in die Berge werden mir stets in bester Erinnerung bleiben. Next slide. Something like our lovely excursions into the mountains will always be my best memories, and thank you for your guiding, or Führung. I don't know whether you could translate. No doubt people could translate this better, but guidance or guiding. So, Geisler, as a geographer, really loves and appreciates being able to go through the Macdonnell Ranges on this travel, which goes right, I think, to Mount Zeal. It'd be interesting to reenact it and to see exactly where they went. Heinrich is a kind of go-between because he's speaking Aranda, been speaking it for 9 years. So a lot of place names are learned. So at one point, Geisler says, "What's the name of this place?" And I think it's Heinrich telling him, "Look, all the mountains and gullies and everything have names here. This is Aranda, and that hill over there is Quarednuma." And so an enormous amount of really interesting sort of ethnographic observations in here. When they meet the Luritja people speak a little bit of Aranda, maybe not. They mostly speak a language quite unrelated, or actually completely unrelated to Aranda, as we heard from Clara's talk a few FoLA talks ago. We talked about Western Desert Arandic languages and how they're quite different. And so Luritja people speak a completely different lingo. Just to throw in something for bilingual German-English. There's all kinds of would you call them neologisms? I think there's one or two we have to check there, but you've got kangaroo fad, kangaroo pad, and the Das Wasserloch in Ormiston, a waterhole in Ormiston. The Hauptkette des Macdonnell Gebirges. What would that be? Dr. Micken?
The main chain of Macdonnell Ranges.
Yep. And we have Packpferden, the people called the Aranda Leute. These are just a few that I've gleaned from my very slow reading of this book, using a dictionary and Google Translate quite a bit of the time, but There's a lot more, but this is Deutsch, which is adapting to a new country. Sometimes it's completely calqued or translated literally from English, but there's some which is maybe not too. I think it needs to be studied more because there's a lot of German researchers in Central Australia. There's Walter Geisler and there's Herbert Bazadei and many others that crisscross, Erhard Ahlmann, and it's interesting that almost none of their work has been translated. Their work's not available in English. There's 14 copies of this in the country, in Australia, none in Central Australia, or there's 2 now. But this author is not well known. I think he should be better known because I think his insights are really fantastic. Yeah. Schade. But, someone could translate this. Someone could translate more of Bazadei's work. There's a hope that we might get some more. There's no copy of Carl Strehlow's Die Aranda und Lyrische Stimme. There is an English translation, but no one can get hold of it because it's got restrictions placed upon it. And I think it's really interesting what language actually was Adolph Heinrich speaking when he spoke to Geisler. Was he speaking English, and Geisler's reporting him in German, or was the presumably completely bilingual Heinrich talking to Geisler in German? Do you have any ideas about that? My feeling is that Heinrich grew up in a completely bilingual community. And so, of course, he was a good translator too. He was able to translate from one language to another and use words like these easily. And he could do what a lot of his students could do, which is to go from Aranda to English very seamlessly. So, coming from a bilingual school at Maine, he then went to a bilingual school at Andaria, Hermannsburg. Can we have the next slide, please? In the church. Next one. So, in close collaboration, Carl Strehlow had worked with Moses Jalkabuda, and Jalkabuda was really a Lyrische speaker as well as Aranda speaker, but this hadn't been really known to the missionaries until about the early decades of the 20th century. The first missionaries hadn't really learned Lyrische and just thought that they were the people at a distance. But as more Lyrische people came into Hermannsburg Mission Station, they became more and more in focus. And so, something about Carl Strehlow there. Carl Strehlow made this grammatical description and a word list as well of Lyrische, which the word list contains 6,400 words of Lyrische that goes with the Aranda words. Next slide, please. Yep. So, briefly, Jalkabuda, another one who needs to be better known, is born around the time of the foundation of the mission and becomes an evangelist who travels out widely, taking God's word to people in many far-flung areas. Latz's book is a biography of Moses, and it's taken from a 53-page document which is written in Aranda, translated into English, and Moses Jalkabuda had worked on the Western Aranda New Testament translation from 1913 to 1919 with Carl Strehlow. That was Strehlow's second New Testament he worked on, having worked on the Deary one when he was at Lake Killalpinina. And there's also a biography of Moses that was a brief biography made in 1925. And thanks again to Alona for that. Next slide, please. So, much of the time, Heinrich is actually doing a lot of the baptismal instruction, a lot of church services, a lot of writing sermons and giving them preachers in the congregation, and working with a whole group of Western Aranda church leaders. And so effectively, Heinrich is actually the spiritual advisor of the Hermannsburg community and congregation. And he's helped by these men, Rufus, Ezekiel, and Moses. Yep, next slide, please. Using Carl Strehlow's dictionary, no doubt to find the spellings of words. So this was completed in 1909. This is the one with about... And literature as a language had appeared in this ethnographic and linguistic volume, Die Aranda, but had never really been used in church much until about the arrival of Oscar Liebler. Oscar Liebler was the missionary in charge of Hermannsburg when the Strehlows went over to Europe. And he started to make some translations into literature. In 1924, though, it was Heinrich and Jalkabuddha who began the work, or continued the work. So, I think probably the beginning or the first time I became aware of Heinrich's work at all was when I was about to go overseas and do a talk at a conference. And I was going to talk about Aranda, and then Pastor Robert Borges said to me, have a look at this book we've got in the thing. I thought, that's interesting. Heinrich and Moses. Adolf Heinrich, Moses Atara, Moses Tara, meaning T-A-R-A, that's the two of them. So this is the first hymn book for 20 years, because Carl Strehlow's hymn book, where he retranslated the earlier work, was 1904. He came down and he actually worked in Aric's printery at Langmile on that one, and then that was then available for the congregation there. But this is actually a reworking, probably of Liebler's work, but what Heinrich and Moses have put here is an appendix called is something that's written at the end, in other words, an appendix. The appendix contains a whole lot of hymns, and they're all in literature. Yep. And also the Apostles' Creed, written in literature. So when we look at this, if you look at it and you're used to reading Aranda, like I was looking for Aranda words, I was actually looking for Aljera. So I was going to talk about the word that Hermannsburg missionaries use for God. But this one, Tukor, is the word in Western Desert languages. The equivalent term for Aljera, Aranda Aljera, is equal to Luracha Tukor. So it looks like a fairly literal word-for-word substitution, but many of the words would be similar meaning in the two languages, but completely different words, completely different sounding. So Moses and Heinrich have actually done all of this translation. He translated clearly the first published work. And talking again today with Rob Borges, he says he thinks it's the first literature translation of this type. And so you can see Aranda and literature. You've got Aranda and literature put together, or in John 3:16, word for word, the two different languages. As more literature people come to Hermannsburg, especially during times when there's droughts, and there was a drought between 1926 and 29, more people arrived at the mission. The question is what to do, whether to... It seems as though Heinrich decided, with church leaders like Stolz, to actually send evangelists out to the west. Next one, Ange, please. So, next slide, please. Has anyone heard about the Memory Mountain, the big cross that's being put up there at Haas Bluff? That story? So that's being built by Ken Duncan, a photographer. It's called Memory Mountain because that's in memory of those early evangelists that went out from Hermannsburg. And so they were mostly Aranda-speaking leaders, but some of them went to Hermannsburg and were taught there and then went out back to their own people. And so the Memory Mountain commemorates 1923 as a sending of those evangelists out from Hermannsburg. So I think that the cross is all about this kind of auspicious year is 2023, the centenary, 100th anniversary of that sending of the first evangelist to the literature people. So rather than shrinking, rather than becoming less engaged, Hermannsburg Mission actually started sending church leaders far to the west to groups of people who were living in the bush and taking the Christian gospel out to those people. In conclusion, what can we say about the Heinrich era? And we're still learning a lot. We've still got a lot to learn, no doubt. I don't think that he was just an interim leader who was just waiting for another missionary to arrive. I think he made distinctive and memorable contributions, and there's a lot more that we could say about Heinrich. We talk about his photography, we could talk more about the visitor's book, and imagine Heinrich and imagine Adolf and Hilda hosting all the people in this book, people like Lord Stonehaven, the Governor General, and imagine Geza Roheim, a Hungarian psychoanalyst, Geza and Elena Roheim, turning up from Hungary. They're all in this book, and probably there might one day be a FoLA meeting about the visitor's book or some of the characters in this visitor's book. In conclusion, I'd actually say that his time was extremely interesting. He was very competent at many different skills. And I'd also say that it seems as though God had his hand on Hermannsburg, and it seems as though Heinrich was there and was in place as part of God's plan. That's the way I read it spiritually. Yeah. Another aspect of Heinrichs is that they built lasting relationships with Aboriginal people. I mean, Aboriginal languages were not valued in the 1920s. And this couple have got Aranda names, or actually I think Western Desert name, engraved on their tombstones because they became known as Awa, or old man, and Kungai, which is woman or lady, and they became affectionately known as Awa and Kungai, still engraved on their tombstones. And people wrote to them in Aranda. So this collection of letters, Dear Mr. Heinrich, Andaria letters, 1933 to 1935. After they left Hermannsburg, people wrote to them. What language did they write to them in? In Aranda. There are very few published letters in any Aboriginal language of Australia. These are some of the few. I think mostly written by one or two individuals, but the literacy level of Hermannsburg around that time was actually really very high. Many people could read and write in Aranda thanks to the work of people like Heinrich. A couple of other things I'll just mention. Actually, someone who else who met up with Heinrich and talks about it a lot is this R.H. Kroll. Robert Henderson Kroll, Bob Kroll, rode Wide Horizons, where he travelled to Central Australia 4 times, stayed at Hermannsburg, went to the school, met Heinrich, and they sang he's a jolly good fellow, I think, and the usual sort of turnout. But again, he has the highest regard. He's an educationalist. He's travelling with Stanley D. Porteous, who's a psychologist and a professor of psychology in Hawaii. And so Porteous and him are actually sort of measuring people's intelligence, measuring the natives' intelligence, as it were. And again, they're really impressed by the school out there and by what they're seeing. Any time for questions? Yeah?
Any questions anybody has? Yes? I'm not sure. Okay, Naomi.
Thank you, Dr. David. Now this is probably a question for Peter Micken. Is this mixture of German I can't pronounce it, literature, is that similar to Brosser Deutsch, a mixture or Creole type of language?
So, literature is a complete language in itself, and it relates closely to other languages like Pidginjarra, it's spoken in northern South Australia and also into the Northern Territory. There's a large number of these Western Desert languages with maybe 10,000 speakers. Much of Western Australia is occupied with Western Desert lands, or Western Desert language speakers, and much of northern South Australia and the southern part of the Northern Territory. And so literature is a very widespread language. 2 major dialects. There's Pindabi literature to the west of Alice Springs and southern literature to the south of Alice Springs, basically.
Okay, any other questions?
Thank you. What divided the languages? Was there a mountain? There wouldn't have been any mountains to divide the 2 languages. Was there a river between them, or how did they? Like, on this side, they're speaking literature, and the other side. So, yeah, what divided it?
Yeah, so generally geographical features, but land ownership. So the land and the speakers, the speaker relate to each other exactly, so that these. Yeah, well, that's a great question, because people know them to be discrete languages. So people know when they're speaking Lurcha and they know when they're speaking Aranda. And so they're not all mixed up. But there's also a lot of multilingualism where people know one language and they know that person walking in the door speaks Lurcha. I stop speaking Aranda to these people and suddenly change to Lurcha to accommodate that person. Very widespread phenomenon, and people can speak 4, 5 languages and are able to do that and have a very great proficiency in knowing who speaks what and speaking as closely as they can to that person's language.
Okay, any other question? Dr. Micken.
Thank you very much, David. I think you've opened up a big story. What I imagine was that Lehrer Heinrich wrote letters to the mission committee here in South Australia to Pastor Stolzen people, and those letters must be somewhere in the Lutheran archives or hidden under rocks. So it would be very interesting to hear about those letters, finding them, hear about them, read them, translate them.
Yeah, that's right. There's a massive correspondence that needs to be looked into. Yes. Yes, that's right. The correspondence is often found in Philip Shearer's works. He has, like for example, this paper, this excerpt here, which Tony's just given me, developing a mission strategy, and is all about Stolz's attempt to send evangelists to the West. And so it summarises correspondence and mission minutes. I have a bit of a theory on this. I think that Stolz was interested in finding out about the people to the West, and he requested information. He requested information about the people west of Hermannsburg to the settled districts in Western Australia. A huge area, mostly occupied by Western Desert language speakers. I actually think Heinrich had a much bigger role because he was the one on the ground. Stolz occasionally visited, and Riedel occasionally visited as well. But Heinrich was the one doing the day-to-day work. And I think it's easy to downplay someone with logistical and practical abilities in favour of the kind of theorists. I mean, Stolz actually read a book written by Vornek, the missiologist, and he was also probably influenced by that 1910 Edinburgh World Missions Conference, which had a new approach to mission. But the actual implementation was Heinrich on the ground.
My interest particularly is with teacher Heinrich when he was at Nain. I belong to the Nain congregation and I look after the history of the place, I suppose. And I've got quite a lot of photographs of his era at the Nain school, and that photo that was shown up here, I think I've got the names of all the students plus one or two others. And I've also got a summary, quite a few pages from Pastor Materney of his childhood memories, including school. So your work here is certainly beyond that, but before we went up to Hermannsburg, I've certainly got some of the things there that might be of interest to you.
Thanks.
You'll have to come back to South Australia again or to the Barossa. Any other questions? If not, you're most welcome to speak to David afterwards during supper, and I'll ask Helen to move a vote of thanks.
Well, I knew nothing about teacher Heinrich until tonight, but I think you've given us a very full picture of his abilities, his teaching prowess, and his work amongst the Aboriginals in 2 languages. So I think that's a very full picture of this man who has been neglected apparently in the official histories of the Lutheran Church simply because he was a more practical person rather than a theoretician. Perhaps that's why. But you've certainly built him up in our imaginations now to be a very full figure, and we can only thank God for what he did in Hermannsburg when it was kind of in a wilderness, if it wasn't for Heinrich. And he was able to steer the mission very well in the absence of a pastor. Pastors are not everything. Lay people can also play their parts. And as once upon a time a teacher myself, I can relate to Heinrich very well. I would have loved to listen in on how he taught the children multiplication.
Yeah. I should have said that he taught them 3 languages, because he actually taught them English as well.
Right.
So, he didn't officially teach them literature, but he was heavily involved with literature people. But when you look at the Whitlam government's move into bilingual education around 1973-74, now 50 years old, who was the inspiration for bilingual education? The NT policy of capital B bilingual education was Hermannsburg. Kim Beazley Sr. saw that Hermannsburg actually taught English better than monolingual schools. Bilingual schools teach English better than, because you have that comparison, you have that chance to become a translator and learn all about how 2 languages work, as I think the probably experience of the German English bilingual experience would show as well.
Well, thank you very much for giving us a person who will live forever in our memories after tonight. Thank you, David.
Good. Thanks, Ellen. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Another thing that might be of interest to some of you, our latest publication review in relation to Hermannsburg is a summary of articles by a number of prominent people involved in establishing unique name items, recognition of the Aboriginal people in the Hermannsburg area, and the same being available for a few months and selling very well. $15 in the proposition. So, I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation, and you're certainly all welcome to come here again next month, or you can join FoLA too. We're always looking for new members, and as Lois said, next month's focus during history months will be on the artist's work of George French Angus. So you'll be most welcome to stay for supper over in the church hall, and perhaps have a look at some of these publications that are floating around the place here, relative to tonight's topic. So thank you for coming, safe trip home, and just avoid all traffic. Thank you.